Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogmen, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural, and this week we're not going to be speaking to a guest. This is a story about a very unusual collection, if you want to call it that, and this is titled On the Trail of the Headhunters. In the early 1900s, shrunken heads, known as santas or santas, were acquired at U.S. museums. Despite being macabre, they fascinated the public. During the early 20th century, travelogues of life in the darkest jungles of the Amazon were written by Lewis Cotlow and Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. In 1940, Gustav Struve, a native of Ecuador of German descent, made the rounds of the speaking circuit with a presentation titled My 4 Years with the Headhunters of the Amazon. His story placed him as the only survivor of an ill-fated botanical expedition. It seems he was spared and married the chief's daughter. During his years among the headhunting tribe, he learned the secret process of shrinking human heads and even entire bodies. He finally made an escape with her child. Prior to this, he had attended university in Guayaquil and went on to marry an Ecuadorian woman. They had a son. During the early 1920s, he traveled throughout South and Central America conducting business. This lifestyle brought about a permanent separation from his wife. He immigrated to Chicago in 1925 and worked for the Argentine consulate. He married his second wife, Gertrude, in 1939. Research into Struve's expeditions, where he was supposedly taken prisoner by Amazonian natives, could not be substantiated, and his references were vague. Supposedly, it was a botanical journey initiated in 1914. However, among Struve's papers, there was newspaper clippings of a talk given by Herbert Huth, a German engineer, who detailed the exact experiences Struve described. Huth claimed he was taken captive by cannibals near the headwaters of the Amazon during the 1920s. He also learned the secrets of shrinking heads and bodies. It's believed Struve used the story as the inspiration for his lectures during a time when adventure stories thrived. Fritz W. Updegraff wrote a book in 1923 where he wrote of a man in Panama who, quote, made a business of preparing and shrinking heads, and who has even shrunken two entire bodies, one of an adult, the other evidently a child, end quote. Struve, by his own admission, lived in Panama during 1923. Was he shrinking human heads there as well? Besides speaking about his adventures, Struve sold jibaro, shrunken head trophies. He sold one in 1933 to the Adventurers Club for $52. One of the shrunken men was sold to New York City Museums of the American Indian, or MAI, which came with a price tag of $500, which in 1923 was a significant amount of money. Due to the demand for shrunken heads, producing counterfeit ones became a cottage industry. They were not produced by the Jibaro tribes, but mostly by individuals who used the bodies of unclaimed paupers to fill the demands from the tourists. M.W. Sterling, an ethnographer, wrote in 1938, that he believed the counterfeit shrunken heads were being produced as far back as 1872 in different places in Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador by a white man living on the border of the Jibaro country. He had learned the process from the natives between the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Fake Santas were differentiated by having facial hair, since the Jibaro would singe any hair off. Vine was used to close the lips versus string, and they didn't have holes in the skull, which would enable a warrior to hang it around his neck during ceremonies. The Jibaro tribes believed that killing a man created an avenging soul, or muisak, that would leave the corpse via the mouth and come after the perpetrator, which is the reason the lips were sewn shut. The slain enemy was also compelled to serve the shrinker, since his soul was harnessed inside the head. The Shuar people called a shrunken head santas. True ceremonial ones would have charcoal rubbed over it to prevent the spirit from seeing out. In the 2002 book Shrunk Heads, Santas Trophies, and Human Exotica, it was found that only 23 of 125 museum and privately collected heads are authentic. Whether the curator knew at the time of the sale is unknown. The motivation to buy it anyway was there, since the shrunken heads were sure to draw audiences when they were displayed. In 1926, Carl Lester Little, an American journalist and collector, described seeing a shrunken head the first time being displayed in the window of a big New York store. It was about the, quote, size of an orange, black and shiny, with strongly marked little features and long, coarse black hair, end quote. A placard underneath it explained it was produced by the Shuar Indians in Ecuador. He decided to travel to South America to discover how they were produced. He was in Argentina, and the day before he was to set to leave into the jungles, a veteran American traveler who was an old friend told him he was a fool. He said, quote, "Do you realize that you'll be the first white man most of those Indians have ever laid eyes on? One of the few whites that have been donkey enough to risk it? Brown heads with long black hair are familiar to those devils. But think what they'd do to get hold of a white head. You'll be a curiosity for once in your life. If you go in, some Indian will come to me a year or so from now to get $1,000 out of me for a rare white head. Nothing like it has been seen before. And my friend, that head will be your head. Don't go into the Oriente of Ecuador. It's sheer craziness." End quote. Despite the advice, he left to what was called the land of the headhunters, land of the phantom hunters, and land of women manhunters. This area included part of Ecuador and part of Peru. He traveled 2 weeks, reaching the Andean heights, until arriving in the jungle where the Shuar lived. The first village they reached was the Arepicos, which was made up of 15 or 20 huts with thatched roofs. Based on the information he garnered along the way, he decided to pose as a white capitu, or witch doctor. He also grew his beard out. He knew he had to be careful not to incur any revenge from the natives, where revenge was a cult. He spent 3 days there, and was warned not to cross an invisible line that divided where the men slept and where the harem slept. The guy told them his last client ended up getting his head chopped off, since the natives were very jealous. Before he left, the chief took him to a room where he kept 11 heads. The mouths were sewn with red cord in order to keep the spirit submissive. The Shuar native explained that he had acquired the trophies by wiping out the males of an entire family who were blood-fueled enemies. The man laid a finger on one of the heads, and with gleaming eyes explained, "This one was once on the shoulder of a mighty man who had the wickedness to steal one of my wives. He and his brothers and his sons, we made their heads small." End quote. He traveled further into the interior, staying with different Shuar villagers. One day he spent the night with his guides in the hut of a half-breed trader. Early one morning, as they were about to leave, he saw one of the guides dipping the tip of his lance into a gourd of poison that always hung over his shoulder. For a moment, he was not sure who the guide meant to kill. Suddenly the man plunged his lance into the half-breed's chest and then vanished into the jungle. He reached for his rifle when his main guide, Juanga, held him back. He said, "Put down the rifle. It is a custom with the headhunters that they enjoy killing someone at the break of day. It brings good luck for the rest of the trip." The murderous guide eventually rejoined the party. Unexpectedly, they stumbled on a war party made up of 80 warriors. They were excited and dancing. On a banana leaf lay a collection of severed enemy heads. He saw where each had received a vertical blow at the back with a machete. He didn't describe the rest of what he called gruesome details, only saying the santas were fitted over a wood ball about the size of an orange. During the ritual, the men yelled and the wives sang, which was to render harmless the spirit of the enemy. When the head was dry, it was rubbed with a liquid to make the skin hard. The wooden ball was removed from the slit in the back of the head, which was then sewed up. The victory feast could last from 6 months to a year, and even 2 years. Guests would come by the hundreds and spend a week. He ran into a problem when he tried to take a lock of hair from one of the women. A witch doctor warned that witchcraft on a woman, where she was prayed to death, could be done if her hair was taken. Much of the ceremony was done to make sure the victim did not inflict revenge on the slayer. He spent a year traveling throughout headhunter territory. He went on to describe that secret traffic existed for the heads, where tourists in Ecuador had paid as high as $500 for one of them. Ecuador passed a law which made it a crime to sell or buy the shrunken heads, and tourists could not take them through customs. However, a bootlegging operation sprung up to meet the demand. In 1928, Don Ramiro de Velasco of Buenos Aires brought a collection of historic Spanish and Inca antique art to Los Angeles. Among the pieces of intrinsic value because of their rarity might also be mentioned a collection of shrunken and mummified heads, an art known only to 3 tribes of Ecuador Indians, the Santas, the Jibaros, and the Macabeos. In the 1940s, the Jibaro tribe learned that shrunken heads could be traded for a shotgun. Shuar warriors would take the heads of whole families belonging to the Achuar tribes. They did this for 2 reasons. One was the commerce aspect. The other was since the Achuar were reduced to using spears, they were easier to capture. They would refer to the Achuar as fish, as in, let's go catch some fish. Thor Heyerdahl recounts in his book, The Kon-Tiki Expedition, published in 1948, the various problems he experienced in acquiring balsa wood for his expedition raft. The wood was in the Jibaro area in Ecuador, and the local guides refused to take him into the jungle for fear of being killed for their heads. By 1998, the Achuar had the world's 2nd highest murder rate. According to anthropologist John Patton, who studied intertribal murder and revenge in the Conambo River Valley, observed Achuar men would not so much as go out for a piss without bringing a rifle. In 2016, a museum did a DNA analysis of a shrunken head they had. The curators were told it belonged to a male shaman who had failed to cure a child and was killed by the father. The analysis revealed the head belonged to a woman. This disputed the Shuar society reasoning for taking a head, which was to stop the soul of the warrior from taking revenge. Shuar women were never warriors. The reason why she was used is unknown. Most probably it was for commercial purposes. It's not even known if she was a native. She could have just been a body that ended up unclaimed in the morgue. A shrunken head is created by removing the skull from the neck, then a cut is made on the back of the ear, and the cranium is defleshed. The discarded skulls would often be offered to anacondas, which were seen as spiritual guides. Red seeds are placed underneath the nostrils, the eyes and lips are sewn shut and kept closed with 3 palm pins. A wooden ball is placed inside the skull space, and the head is boiled in water laced with herbs containing tannins for about 2 hours. Once removed, it's one-third its original size. It's turned inside out, and the remaining flesh is scraped off. It's then folded back and sewn back together. Afterward, the head is dried with sand and hot rock so it will retain its human features. The skin is rubbed with charcoal ash, and adornments are added such as decorative beads. Shrinking heads was also practiced by Maori in New Zealand in an act called moko makai. Only men of high status who wore full moko tattoos on their faces could have their likeness preserved as spiritual ties to their ancestors. Shrunken heads have also appeared in popular cultures in several instances. In Moby Dick from 1851, the character Queequeg sells shrunken heads and gives one to Ishmael, who narrates the story. The Devil's Mask is a 1946 mystery movie in which the key is a shrunken head. Disneyland's The Jungle Cruise ride, which opened in 1955, had a trader selling shrunken heads. Milton Bradley released Vincent Price's Shrunken Head Apple Sculpture Kit in 1975. The 1990 video game Dr. Mario featured a shrunken head. The story, How I Got My Shrunken Head, published in 1996, part of the Goosebumps series, is about a boy who's gifted with a head by his aunt, which gives him jungle powers. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, a shrunken head is hung on the rearview mirror of the night bus. In the movie, At World's End, Captain Jack Sparrow wears the shrunken head of his mother tied to his belt. The film, Beetlejuice, released in 1988, has a scene where a dead hunter waits his turn. It's obvious he died because his head was shrunken. In the sequel, Beetlejuice, released in 2024, the hunter, whose name is Bob, returns as an employee at Beetlejuice's personal call center. And the following is a short little story made up, I hope, of an encounter with a shrunken head in a museum. I never knew my mother. I was only 8 months old when she died. Well, when she was murdered. I don't know much else about it. In fact, I didn't even know she was murdered until 2 years ago when I was 15. You see, my dad doesn't like to talk about her at all. And so he never discussed why she was no longer with us. I have seen photos of her, so I know what she looks like. But I wasn't told much about her. I always thought that she died of a sickness or maybe in a freak accident. So I was very surprised when I found out that she had been murdered. I wish that my father would talk about it more, though, because I want to know how it happened. I heard a few rumors at school about how she died. I overheard one kid say she was kidnapped and held for ransom before being killed when my dad didn't pay. Another kid told me that she was decapitated and her head was never found. So I really didn't know what to believe, and I couldn't ask my dad to fill in the details. Ever since I found out about my mother's fate, however, I have become overly interested in true crime, and I especially enjoy learning about unsolved mysteries. That's how I found out about the strange museum that suddenly appeared in my town. My friend Ellie had first told me about it. "Have you seen that museum that opened in the old library?" she asked me one day at lunchtime. I replied that I hadn't seen it and that I didn't know anything about it. So she went on to explain what it was. I heard that it's a museum that is all about famous murder cases and has a lot of exhibits that feature real crime scene photos and even a few items that were taken from murder sites, she explained. "I'm going there on Saturday. Did you want to come?" I thought about it for a moment, but then remembered that I had planned to spend the day with Dad, so I had to tell her that I couldn't make it, which she seemed disappointed about. I thought about this museum for the rest of the school day, and I began to wonder what crimes would have exhibits. Maybe they will have an exhibit for my mom. I thought maybe I could find out more about her murder. I thought long and hard about whether or not I should try and go to the museum, and finally I decided that I would go on Sunday. My dad was going out of town that day for work, so it was the perfect time to go. I spent the rest of the week leading up to Sunday both excited and nervous. I was excited because I knew that I would find the museum very interesting, but nervous because I didn't know exactly what to expect. When Sunday finally rolled around, I was more excited than nervous. My dad left early on Sunday morning, so I knew I had most of the day to explore the mysterious museum without him seeing me there. I got up around 8:30 and got dressed and ready for my day. I then walked across town to where the library used to be. I soon arrived and saw that instead of the sign that used to read Town Library, there was now a sign that was freshly painted with the words, The Murder Museum. There was already a couple of people in the line when I arrived, and so I stood behind them and waited my turn to enter the museum. In front of me was a large man that had a small tattoo of a bird on his cheek. He appeared to also be by himself, and it looked like he was quite excited to go in. He made it to the front of the line and bought a ticket and entered through the front door. It was now my turn, so I walked up to the little booth that had been set up and I approached the younger man sitting inside the booth. The man selling the tickets was about 25 years old, and he had long black hair and a large smile that was filled with crooked yellow teeth. "Ticket for one, please," I said to the young man, and handed over a $10 note that I had gotten from my part-time job. The man took my money without saying anything and handed me a small paper ticket that read Admit 1. He then pointed me to the direction of the front door and said, "Enter at your own risk." I walked over to the main door and pushed it open and stepped inside, not knowing what to expect. What I found inside was mostly old newspaper articles of old murders and old fading photos of what appeared to be crime scenes. They were all in a glass display, and the displays lined up in a row that led to another door. I looked through each newspaper article, searching for any mention of my mother. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about her. Not even a mention of her name was present in any of the newspaper articles. I was disappointed, but I still found it fascinating, reading about all the true crime that had been committed. I read about Kevin Fuller, the killer, who would hide his victims' bodies inside his own private jet, and I read about Terry Stewart, the man who murdered both of his closest friends. I probably spent an hour or so walking down the long line of displays that featured the newspaper articles. I finally made it to the end of the row of newspaper cuttings and found myself standing in front of a small black door. It was shut, but I had no other way to go but through it. I opened the door, which creaked as I opened it, and I stepped through into the next room. This room had a lot more interesting items. There were displays of old clothing that, according to the small plaques underneath displays, were clothes that the victims were wearing when they were killed. There was also a few murder weapons that were in small glass cases. There were a few knives, a couple of handguns, and even a machete that apparently were used in various murders. I did find this interesting, but I found myself becoming a little bit overwhelmed. Thinking about all of the victims got me thinking about my own mother. I didn't spend too long in this room because I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I moved through the large number of display cases, trying to avoid looking at what was contained inside, and I moved to another door. This was one that was a bit larger than the previous one, and it was painted a dark red color. I opened the door and stepped into the next room, worried about what I might find. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was the large glass case that stood in front of me. Inside was a smaller car, a Volkswagen Golf, I think it was. I quickly read that this car was used to lure victims, and then they would be killed inside of the car. I felt chills run down my spine as I learned that people were killed inside of the car that I was currently looking at. I turned away from the car, and that's when I saw it. The shrunken head, sitting in a small glass case across the other side of the room. I had heard of shrunken heads before, and I had seen a few photos of them, but I had never seen one in real life. I excitedly walked over to it and had a look at the small shriveled head that was staring back at me. I looked at the head and had a sudden sense that I recognized the head. I looked closer, and even though the head was a lot smaller than usual, and it was shriveled and it was hard to make out any facial features, I could still tell exactly who this used to be. It was Ellie, my friend from school, who told me about the museum. I knew that she had come here yesterday, and I hadn't spoken to her since, and I suddenly knew that something terrible had happened. I stood there frozen for a minute, not knowing what to do or what had happened to Ellie yesterday at this museum. Could the same thing happen to me? I didn't even want to think about it. All I knew was that I had to get out of here. I began to run back the way I came and tried to open the dark-colored door that I had entered through. It was locked from this side. It was only open to people coming through, but you couldn't go back through it once you had already entered. All I could do was keep on going through the museum. No one else was around, and I hadn't seen anyone for quite a while, which was strange, because there was definitely people lining up behind me. I knew that I had to continue, so I ran to the next door that was on the other side of the room, past a shrunken head. I didn't look at it as I ran past. I made it to the next door, a small green door. I opened it and went through. I could see that this room was empty apart from rows of pots, all sitting on top of small portable gas stoves. I cautiously approached the first pot and had a look inside. I just had to know what was in there, and once I knew, I really wish I hadn't. Inside the pot, looking back at me, was another head that was boiling inside of the pot. I could already see that this head was slightly smaller than when I had last seen it. It was the small bird tattoo on the head's face that made me realize who I was looking at. I knew that this man entered before me, and somehow his head was now getting boiled inside a pot, getting shrunk inside of a pot. Suddenly, there was a noise behind me, and I saw a masked man walk out of a door that was hidden in the corner of his room. He was heading straight towards me, and he was holding a machete. I knew that it was now my turn to become just a head, just a shrunken head. I felt adrenaline racing through my body, and I began to sprint in the opposite direction of the man who was approaching me. I managed to run to the other end of the room, past the row of boiling pots. I saw that there was a small door on this side of the room. I managed to reach it, and I looked back and saw that the man with the machete was now gaining on me. He was not far from reaching me now. I turned to the doorknob on the door, and luckily it opened. I felt sunlight hit my face. I was now outside. I was out in the back of the library. I kept running, trying to get back to the front of the library, and then as far away as possible. I was still expecting the door I had come through to swing open and the masked man to run out, but it never did. I managed to navigate my way back to the front of the library, and once I was back to the front, I saw that there was no lineup of people waiting to enter. I probably wouldn't have stopped to warn them, even if there was a lineup. I knew that I needed to get as far away from this place as possible, so that's exactly what I did. I did go to the police about what I experienced, and they rushed down to the museum just in case what I was saying was true. When the police arrived, the library was empty. Everything was gone. The newspaper cuttings, the weapons, the car, and the shrunken head. I do not know where they all went, but all I know is that they have left my town. Ellie is still classified as missing, and the police say that no one knows what happened to her. But I do. I know what happened. The following is a fictional short story about shrunken heads, and it's titled The Santa in the Parlor by Stephen Grenton, which happens to be a pen name for August Derleth, who was a close associate of H.P. Lovecraft and, as a matter of fact, published his first set of works. This story was written right around the time that the Santas or the shrunken heads were very popular in the United States. Here we go. After 7 years of profound silence, surely a length of time sufficiently long to have encouraged hope for the worst, Ernest Ambler made it plain to his uncle Theophilus that he was not, after all, dead. Lost in the wilds of South America, as he put it, but not permanently. His letter was followed by his peace offering, and no doubt the old man reflected pessimistically his peace offering would in all probability shortly be followed by Ernest himself, and there would begin once more the problem of waiting upon Ernest's better nature just long enough to allow his real self to assert control, after which Ernest would need to be packed off to some remote place all over again. Full circle. Circles, rather. I may very well be a crusty old curmudgeon, said Theophilus to the single servant who waited upon him in his gloomy old house on Main Street in the southern town of Euphoria. But naturally, I couldn't believe it, could I? No, of course not. He went on replying to his question as he had replied to his own questions for half a century gone by. Nor do I need Ernest to remind me. What a curse on my old bones! To have to deal with Ernest once, twice, thrice, and God knows how many times. Get his room ready, Fulton. And what was in that box? I noticed you took the stamps off for your cousin's girl. I hope her collection is growing. It is, Mr. Ambler. Very much. Thanks to you, partly. The box, Fulton. Yes, sir. A small object? Yes, it was, wasn't it? Oh, forgive me. You meant its contents. I referred to the box. My error. A small object. What kind of object? It was a shriveled something. Rubbery. Where is it? Over on the mantel. I thought perhaps it was meant to belong with your collection of ivory and ebony pieces. Theophilus Ambler meandered over to look at his nephew's peace offering. He was a tall, thin man, but not cadaverous so much as anemic-looking, still able to despite his 70-odd years, and only a little absent-minded. He put on his pince-nez and peered. The peace offering stood between an ivory elephant and an ebony rook, looming larger than either. Brown, shriveled, rubbery indeed, with a resemblance to a monkey's head. It was not nice to touch. He swept it off the mantel in the palm of his hand, and held it forth into the sunlight streaming through the French windows. Ernest will never change, he said. I suppose you would call in a sense of humor. What is it, Mr. Ambler? Damn it, man. You might have seen it for yourself. It's a human head, shrunken, of course. Probably Jivaro in origin. They call these things santas. There are still headhunters down there, I suspect. It doesn't seem to be Ernest's head, though. Much too dark. A native, probably. It's an odd gift, isn't it? Only Ernest would think of it. And what the devil am I to do with it? I don't know. No one would notice it among those pieces, sir. That's why I put it there. Ambler smiled and replaced it. Good enough. Now, let me have his letter again. I think it's in the pocket of your robe, sir. Oh, yes, so it is. He took it out and read it slowly, aloud, while Fulton stood in almost obsequious attention. Dear Uncle Theophilus, like a bad penny I am turning up again. It now seems quite possible that I may be in the States again within a few weeks or months. Events will determine that, and I should like to see you, naturally. I hope all is forgiven. Under separate cover, I am sending you a little curio, which you might like. I picked it up not so long ago and thought of you immediately. My best wishes. Best wishes indeed. That is an ambiguous letter in my opinion, but of course Ernest never wrote anything straightforward in his life, or spoke it either. How long ago was it written? 3 weeks? I suppose we can expect him any day. I'm afraid so, sir, agreed Fulton. Fulton drifted out of the room, and Theophilus was left alone. He made a determined effort to put the unpleasant thought of his nephew from his mind, and settled down to read. But Ernest persisted. Ernest, who had never been a very pleasant child, and who had made life miserable for practically everyone, relative or friend, with whom he had been associated. And how long will it be before I have to get him out of another scrape, he wondered. He was really getting too well along in years for that sort of thing, he felt. Not really doddering yet, of course, but still, no longer young. And Ernest, who must now be well into his 40s, was old enough by this time to know what responsibilities meant. But he knew in his heart that Ernest would never be old enough for that. In the night the house creaked and groaned in the wind. Rafters cracked, and the bushes around the old building whispered in the hushing night air. Theophilus Amber went to his bed not long after sundown, and Fulton went shortly thereafter. The old house was thus quickly lulled in darkness, and the sounds it made were long familiar. Mice scuttered in the attic, making their intimate small patterings. Theophilus had come to welcome them. He slept to their footsteps, and no creak or crack or groan invaded his sleep. But this night, a new sound flowed through the house. Theophilus woke to it at last. He lay for a while listening, and decided finally that it must be Fulton talking in his sleep, or grumbling. He sighed and waited for the sound to subside. But it did not subside, so Theophilus dragged himself out of bed, got into his slippers and dressing gown in the dark, puttered over to a candle, lit it, and held it before him to light his way into the hall. He went down to Fulton's room, opened the door, and looked in. Fulton's face caught the flickering candlelight. Theophilus listened. No sound, nothing whatever from Fulton. Fulton lay in peaceful sleep, as quiet as a tired child, and a child he is sometimes, reflected Theophilus wearily, withdrawing again and closing the door. He stood there in the shadowed hall listening. Certainly there was a voice somewhere. Since it was not Fulton's, it must belong to someone else. A faint prickle of perturbation made itself evident. No one else should be in the house, and the sound came from inside. The wind would have whipped breath away from anyone beyond the walls. Thoughtfully, Theophilus blew out the candle. He felt somewhat more secure in darkness, without the light to offer himself as a target for any possible invader. But who would invade the house? And for what? For there was nothing of value in any part of it. And what potential burglar would announce himself so carelessly? The darkness enfolded him. The darkness enclosed him in an uncertain security. He went noiselessly back along the hall to the head of the stairs. The sound came from below, steadily. But what was it? A muttering, or a tittering, a shrill gibberish, or an incoherent series of mouthings, scarcely human. And yet, now and then it seemed there were guttural words. Ambler listened, straining himself to detach and isolate recognizable sounds, and presently, slowly, word by word, fragments of a sentence fell into his consciousness, and he put them together painstakingly, while the darkness pressed about him with false security. In this house is Mr. Ambler. The darkness concealed menace. The terrible muttering from below gave birth to alarm. Ambler was not afraid, but he was not inclined to dare the unknown without weapons, and without some knowledge of what he might face. He felt instinctively that something dreadful lurked in the darkness below. "Bite," said the gibbering voice. "Bite," came the muttering. "Bite," rose out of the incoherent sounds from below. "In this house," it said again. And what a horrible tittering sound! How primitive, thought Ambler in some confusion. His confusion was, however, controlled. He made no betraying sound. Whatever it was menaced him, he was sure. The silence which fell was as sudden as it was unexpected. It made Theophilus Ambler even more uncomfortable than the sounds. But what came after was even worse in that sentient darkness. A new sound, now an incredible sound. Someone weeping. Someone sobbing. Ambler stood there listening unbelievingly. What in God's name had got into the house? He felt his skin crawl. He felt something gnawing at the pit of his stomach. He felt in turmoil, in a wretchedness of undefined fear, and a kind of sick loathing, for the sound was so piteous that it was revolting. The sound of grief diminished, fell away, was gone, and the silence came. In a little while, the familiar signature of the old house began once more serenely, the creaking and cracking and groaning, the wind's hush-hush at the eaves, the comfort of mice scampering above overhead. The awfulest Ambler retreated noiselessly to his room, where he sat for a long time listening and wondering before he brought himself to put off his slippers and dressing gown and return to bed. He considered inquiring next morning to Fulton whether he had heard anything in the night, but thought better of it. If Fulton had heard, he would find some opportunity to mention it. If he had not, there was no need to alarm him. That would come soon enough if the experience persisted. Nevertheless, the awfulest Ambler made a thorough search of the old house. He turned up several articles which had been lost for years, but nothing at all to show up that anyone had got into the house during the night. Every door and every window remained locked, just as they had been at bedtime the previous night. Moreover, nothing whatever was in any way disturbed. Could it have been that one of the vagabonds from the other side of town had got drunk and wandered into the neighborhood, finding himself a corner somewhere outside the house from which the sounds, despite the tearing wind, had reached into and through the walls? But no, hardly. That was stretching the bounds of probability too far. Yet it was undeniable that the sounds he had heard in the night might very well have been made by some vagabond or hobo. The awfulest sat for a time in the horsehair-furnished parlor, ostensibly reading but secretly pondering the problem. With each hour that passed, his perplexity grew. More than once he gazed meditatively over at that curious peace-offering of Ernest's, and at last he went to bring it out into a strong light so that he could examine it closely. Was it his imagination, or was the thing damp? He looked at it closely. It had once been a fine head, he decided, almost Nordic save for its dark skin and the cut of the mouth. He fingered it judiciously. It seemed that some kind of teeth had been put into it, very sharp too. The jaws seemed firm enough. He replaced it on the mantel. His improbable theory was made untenable, and he was left more puzzled than ever. Several times during that day he found himself regarding the jibaro head with mixed emotions, uppermost among which was the impulse to rid himself of the object with summary dispatch. He waited for night with some apprehension. That night he lay in his dark bedroom at the head of the stairs, waiting for untoward sounds, for no wind filled the old house with the familiar noises to which the awfulest had been so long accustomed. The clock struck 9. The clock struck 10. The clock struck 11. Outside, the town grew quiet towards midnight as the streets emptied and the last late crowd from the last picture show dispersed. Inside the old house on Main Street, the voice began again. The awfulest rose at once. He had not undressed, but had only put on his gown, in one pocket of which he had taken care to place a small pistol. He had put out a strong-beam flashlight, feeling more secure with it in his hand than candles, and so armed, he set out from his room, walking with every caution to the head of the stairs, and slowly down, step by step, careful to make no sounds. The voice gibbered in the darkness. The voice complained, argued, cried, a horrible cacophony in the black well below. Near the bottom of the stairs, the awfulest paused. The atmosphere of the menace around him was thick, unpleasant, cloying. Once again there were audible words, disjointed, almost meaningless. Head of stairs, room, in, these house, in, third night. And again gibberish, horribly intermingled with sounds of grief. And what was to be made of that? The sounds came from the parlor, beyond any question. Mustering his courage, Theophilus tiptoed down the hall towards the old-fashioned portieres which marked the entrance to the parlor. In the silence which held the house, the sounds seemed twice and three times as loud as they were, so that at any moment Theophilus expected a distraught Fulton to appear at the head of the stairs. But there was no betrayal from above. He stood before the closed portieres listening. He heard a constant muttering, and paying careful attention, he detected a pattern of gutturals. Words, certainly, but not English. Words in some alien language. Phonetic, he decided probably primitive, with now and then an English word. It struck him very odd that the heavy accent of the English words were so similar to the less obvious accent Ernest had affected when last he had visited in Euphoria. His impulse was to retreat, but he would not yield to it. He did the second best thing. He effected a compromise. Rather than into the parlor, he made a small parting of the portieres at the level of his eyes, thrust his flashlight into the opening, and focusing the beam on the mantel, switched it on. The ivory and ebony figures sprang into being, and the dark brown head, agleam as with perspiration there. It seemed to Theophilus Ambler that there was a burning of tiny eyes, a movement of the shrunken lips. But the instant the light flashed forth, the sound from within the room ceased. There was nothing. But wait, the head was not where he had put it. When last he had put it down, it was left standing next to an ivory knight. Now it stood before a teakwood box, fully a foot and a half away. Could Fulton have moved it? Hardly. Even if he had taken it up, he would have replaced it precisely where it had been. What then? The possibilities which occurred to him were not comforting. Theophilus was not unimaginative, but he was not inclined to accept the products of his imagination too readily. He looked across the room to the figures illuminated by his flashlight's beam. He could not rid himself of the conviction that one among them gazed back with malevolence. He snapped off the light and withdrew, allowing the portieres to close before him. He waited. Nothing happened. He was vaguely disconcerted. He had expected the gibbering and muttering to begin again, but no untoward sound came out of the parlor. Indeed, the room and the house were as one might expect them to be in the dead of the night. Theophilus walked back to the stairs. There he waited a while longer. Nothing took place. No unaccountable sound invaded the darkness. He went slowly up the stairs in the dark, with every step expecting to hear that weird voice again. But he heard nothing. All was as before, except that Fulton was snoring. He's lying on his back again, thought Theophilus. He turned at the head of the stairs and looked back down into the well of black. He had a momentary feeling that someone watched him. He thought he saw a vague shadowy figure, neck to toes, without a head, but he blinked and it was gone. More shaken than he cared to admit to himself, he re-entered his room. He considered blocking the door with a heavy easy-chair in his room, but stoutly refused to give way to a fear so nebulous as that he now entertained. Just to be on the safe side, however, he slipped his pistol under his pillow, and presently he slept after a fashion. The morning brought more than another day. It brought Ernest Ambler, looking, if possibly, more dissipated than ever, with bags under his eyes and smoldering fire, like a fever inside. He was of medium height, stoop-shouldered, and one might have said hawk-like in his appearance, except that it did injustice to a noble family of birds. His face was not so much prepossessing as it was fascinating in a revolting way. He looked and often acted like a character out of a painting of Félicien Rops, quite as if he had practiced every known major vice and quite a few minor ones. Theophilus found his nephew at breakfast when the old man descended. Ernest shot him an unsteady glance. "Hello, Uncle Theo," he said with false heartiness. "You're looking uncommonly well." Theophilus growled in acknowledgment. "And you're looking seedy, if I must say so. Puffy." "It was a long trip." "I'll bet it was. How'd you make it? In steerage?" Ernest set forth his trip in a patience. He made it commendably short. He had been working among the Jibaro Indians. He had sent a sample of their work, but apparently it had not yet arrived. I got it, said Theophilus shortly. Ernest seemed manifestly surprised. Oh, he said. Oh, you did. He licked his lips, but surely not very long ago? 2 days ago. Then this is actually the third day you've had it, isn't it? Stupid question, thought Theophilus. Small wonder he tittered after it. Still had that disgusting accent, too. How the devil did you get along with the Indians, Ernest? Or can you speak their language? I learned it, and I taught some of them English. Oh, I taught them a lot of things, and they taught me. That head I sent you? I can do that sort of thing myself now, and a lot of others. Equally reprehensible, no doubt. Ernest frowned angrily. You would think so. I know the precedents, answered Theophilus curtly. How long are you planning on staying? Oh, not too long. A week or two, maybe. Then I must go back. I've got quite a reputation among those Indians. I can imagine. You'll find it hard to believe, but they think I'm a big medicine man. The equivalent of an African witch doctor, no less. He was gloating. He was actually proud of what the Jivaros thought. Theophilus repressed a shudder. Congratulations, he said dryly. And tell me, Ernest, that head you sent me. Did it take you very long? Oh, no, just... Ernest caught himself and glared at the old man. What do you mean? What did you think I meant? Countered Theophilus blandly. Ernest swallowed. You always think the worst of me, he muttered. Ah, and whose fault is that? Theophilus got up, leaning above his nephew. He had scarcely touched his coffee, but he no longer had any appetite for it. If you're staying, Ernest, you take the room next to mine. I have to tell you, though, there appears to be somebody else in the house, besides Fulton and me. You'll find out about that in good time. Ernest stared after him with narrowed eyes. Theophilus was profoundly disturbed. He read his nephew's eyes. He read hope, hate, avarice. He read more. And how curiously Ernest had spoken. He was not cringing, as he had formerly done. He was not apologizing or begging. His was an attitude of watchful waiting, an almost irrepressible gloating straying from behind his feverish eyes. Theophilus continued to be upset at intervals throughout the day. So did Fulton, what with the way in which Ernest presumed to order him about. Ernest managed to surcharge the already troubled atmosphere of the house on Main Street with an explosive chaos. Moreover, as evening approached, Ernest began to get extremely fidgety, and at last, immediately after supper, rose and left the house, mumbling that he would be back later, and no one needed to be waiting up for him, as if anyone intended to do so. The front door will be left open, said Theophilus, and it would be just like Ernest to come in the midst of a soliloquy from that thing in the parlor, he thought. He half hoped he would do so. But that night advanced without the disturbance of the past 2 nights. Theophilus listened for hours. When at last the clock struck 11, he was tense with listening. He heard the murmur of wind in the trees, the creaking of the house, the scuttering of mice, and a quarter past the hour a terrific clatter on the front porch, followed by an assault on the door which opened and closed and permitted Theophilus to hear a succession of unsteady footsteps advancing down the hall. Earnest and drunk, Theophilus sighed. He might have expected that. He got up, pulling on his dressing gown. He opened the door of his room and stood there waiting, listening to Ernest stumbling through the hall up the stairs. He hoped that Ernest would find his own room. That hope, however, was not destined to be fulfilled. Seeing the open door, Ernest came into his uncle's room, lurched across the bed, and flung himself on it. Disgusted, Theophilus walked over and touched him on the shoulder. Ernest looked warily around, bleary-eyed. Seeing Theophilus, his eyes opened wide and closed again tightly. "Go away," he muttered thickly. "Never wash afraid you've live and afraid you dead. Go away." Was it worth it? Theophilus wondered. If I left alone, Ernest might go to sleep in a matter of seconds. If not, he might become obstreperous and insistently difficult. He stood there for a moment, feeling the chill of the night through the dressing gown. Then he gave up and went out, leaving the door ajar so that he might hear if Ernest got up again. He could as easily sleep next door, in the room assigned to Ernest, as in his own, much as he disliked being routed from his own warm bed. He got into Ernest's bed, profoundly hoping that he might be able now to sleep without interruption for what remained of the night. He was. He woke up just as Fulton found him. Fulton, much agitated, his hands almost palsied. He woke quickly. "Mr. Ambler, sir. Mr. Ernest on your bed." "Yes, of course, I let him." "I'm afraid he's ill, sir." "Drunk, damn him. Just plain beastly drunk." Fulton looked apologetically dubious. "But the blood," he said faintly. "Blood?" echoed Theophilus. He got up, forgetting his dressing gown, and walked in his nightshirt as fast as he was able down the hall to his own room. Fulton had not exaggerated. There was quite a bit of blood, emanating apparently from some puffy wound on Ernest's neck. Ernest himself was dead, of that there was not the shadow of a doubt. His neck was torn and lacerated, but not fatally to Theophilus Ambler's untrained eye. "Call somebody," he said to Fulton. "The undertaker?" ventured Fulton. "And the sheriff, too. They'll want to ask questions. They always do." The sheriff came and asked a good many questions, particularly after a report from the county coroner was in. Ernest Ambler had died of poison, evidently administered through the wounds in his neck. Curare, a poison well known to certain Indian tribes of South America. As for the wounds in his neck, clearly bites of some kind, perhaps rats. What did Mr. Theophilus Ambler know about it? Theophilus was not of much help, but for the fact that he had not a shred of motive for wanting his nephew out of the way, it might have gone very badly for him and for Fulton. As it was, the absence of evidence failed to constitute anything positive. 2 or 3 times it was on the tip of his tongue to say something about that strange Santa on the mantel, but he wisely forbore. He might escape a barred cell for a padded one. At the first opportunity, however, he examined the bloodstains on the stairs, which the men from the sheriff's office had found. There were not many, and they ended halfway down the stairs. He went into the parlor. The Santa stood on the very edge of the shelf. There was a red-brown smear at one corner of its mouth. Theophilus had not a doubt, but that if he sent away the pointed teeth from that monkey-like head, he would find the source of the curare which had killed Ernest. He had an understandable reluctance to do so, but something would have to be done about the thing on the mantel. For the time being, it could stay where it was, but not for long. Within a fortnight, the mail brought in a letter sent to Theophilus Ambler by the American consul at Cuenca, Ecuador. Did Mr. Ambler have in his possession a shrunken jibaro head, recently acquired, and if so, would he send it post-haste to the consulate? The consul was sorry, but he had been plagued by a hero woman who had told him a long rigmarole and given him no rest until he sent to inquire. Her husband, whose headless body had been discovered in the garden behind a small house once occupied by Ernest Ambler, who had gone from there, had been murdered by someone, according to her, by Ambler, who had, so she told the council, she had learned from her husband's spectre, performed certain ancient rites and sorcery over the head, and dispatched it to a place in America to do a deed, after which the head would be returned. Now the ghost of the dead Indian appeared nightly to his wife, weeping and clamoring for his head. It was absurd, it was ridiculous, but the council hoped that Mr. Theophilus Ambler knew how difficult a consul's life could be and might understand. Theophilus understood very well indeed. The Santa had been sent to do a deed. On the 3rd night in the room at the head of the stairs, the incorrigible Ernest had counted on the Santa's earlier arrival. Fortunately, Theophilus was in a position to appreciate the irony of the situation, however incredible. He took no chances with the Santa. He packed it carefully and sent it by air to the American consulate at Cuenca.